The gatehouse at Ashcroft was not a place where anyone waited comfortably, and Cecily Vane had now been waiting in it for the better part of an hour. The room was small, low-ceilinged, and smelled of tallow and damp stone. A single candle had been lit when the light failed, though it was not yet 4 in the afternoon, and the November sky outside had collapsed to gray without warning. There was a bench. Cecily sat on it. The constable assigned to watch her stood near the door with his hands behind his back, looking at the floor, which was the only courteous thing she could think of to thank him for. He had not been unkind. He had simply been certain, in the way that men who serve larger men are always certain, that the weight of things was settled. She was not certain of it at all. The ledger page was in her hand. She had taken it out of her boot when the constable's back was turned, not because she intended to do anything with it, but because after 2 years of keeping it there, the feel of it between her fingers was the closest thing she had to steadiness. The paper was worn thin at the fold lines. The ink had browned at the edges. The numbers were still legible. Her father's hand was still precise across the columns, careful as it had always been, careful as it had been his whole life, careful as it had not mattered to anyone at all. She heard the horse before she heard the voice. One horse arriving at speed, which was not the gait of a man coming to inspect a routine matter. The voice that followed was low, unhurried, and carried in the cold air the particular quality of a man accustomed to being answered. Where is she? Cecily did not look at the door. She looked at the ledger page in her hands. She smoothed the fold with one thumb, the same way she had smoothed it 10,000 times, and she listened to the sound of boots on the threshold and the constable's quick shuffling step as he stood straighter. The door opened. Edmund Haverford, Duke of Ashcroft, filled the frame of it. He was taller than she had expected, which was a strange thing to notice first, but she noticed it. His coat was navy, his cravat white and precisely knotted, his expression entirely composed, the way a face is composed when the person behind it is actively arranging it. He had dark hair going silver at the temples and gray eyes that found her immediately. There was a faint horizontal scar across his left brow. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he does not yet have a category for. He looked at what was in her hand. She did not put it away. It was too late for that. And besides, she had not come this far to hide. "You are Cecily Vane," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace." He said nothing for a moment. His eyes were still on the page. Then he stepped into the room and the door closed behind him, and the constable made himself very small and very much against the wall. "My steward tells me," Edmund said, "that you have been found on my grounds for the 3rd time in a fortnight making accusations about the conduct of this estate's accounts." "He is not incorrect," Cecily said. "He tells me you are a beggar woman and a liar." The phrase settled in the room. She let it settle. She did not correct it. Not yet. "He is incorrect about those," she said. Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the ledger page again. He held out his hand, not to take it from her, but in the manner of a man who understood that what he was about to ask would cost something, and was asking, anyway. "Show me," he said. She placed the folded page in his open hand. What she did not yet know, as his eyes moved across the columns her father had ruled with such careful faith, was that the ledger page would not be the last thing she gave him. She did not know that the man she had come to expose lived in this estate, drew his salary from it, and had, 3 years ago, written a letter that kept the Duke from a deathbed he had spent every day since blaming himself for missing. She did not know any of this. She only knew that the numbers were right, and the man reading them was very still. The story of how she came to be sitting on a bench in the Duke of Ashcroft's gatehouse in the winter of 1815 began, as ruin usually does, not with a single catastrophe, but with a slow accumulation of small ones. Her father, Charles Vane, had been a merchant of good standing in the town of Harrow, 3 miles from the Ashcroft estate. He had dealt in grain and tallow and the management of agricultural leases, and he had done this honestly for 30 years, which had earned him a modest comfort, a house on Church Street, and a daughter he educated in the same subjects he respected, figures and correspondence and the careful keeping of accounts. Cecily had learned to hold a quill before she learned to hold a fan. She had never especially minded this. The trouble with Garrett Finch had begun 5 years ago, when the Duke's steward had begun approaching local merchants with an offer. Pay the estate's annual lease through Finch's office rather than through the estate's solicitor. Finch would ensure the assessment was reviewed favorably. It seemed at the time an arrangement. It had been, in fact, a trap. Those who paid through Finch's office paid twice, once to Finch's private collection and once to the estate's official account. When merchants complained, Finch had the estate's authority behind him, the Duke's trust behind that, and a ready-made accusation already prepared: dishonesty, defaulting on payment, an attempt to defraud the Duke of Ashcroft's rents. Her father had complained. He had done this quietly at first, then in writing, then loudly enough that it reached the wrong ears. His leases were not renewed. His credit dried. He died in the spring of 1813, of a fever that settled in his lungs, though Cecily had always privately believed that what killed him first was the particular despair of a careful man made to look dishonest. She had been 22 years old. She had kept his accounting books. 3 months after his death, men she did not recognize had come to the house while she was at the market and burned those books in the front room grate. She had arrived home to the smoke and the ash and 2 pages that had fallen behind the grate's iron bar. 2 pages in her father's hand, with dates and figures that told a story she now understood completely. She had kept those pages in her boot ever since. She had lost the house by the end of that year. By the following spring, she had lost her lodgings on the high street. By the summer, she had run out of people willing to house a woman with no income and a reputation borrowed from her dead fathers, as someone who made accusations she could not prove. She had come to the Ashcroft estate because the estate was where the accounts were, and the accounts were where the truth lived, and the truth was the only asset she had left. She had not expected to find a second set of them. Not yet. She had known where to look. She had, on her second visit to the grounds, left a note in the delivery basket at the tradesman's entrance, addressed to no one in particular, that said only that there was a second ledger in the granary, on the north wall, behind the feed bins. She had not signed it. She had not expected anything to come of it. She had simply reached the point where she had nothing more to lose by trying one more thing. Then Finch had found out she had been on the grounds again, and dispatched a constable. And here she was. The Duke had read the ledger, page 3 times. She had watched him do it without watching, the way she had learned to observe things from the corner of her vision, quietly, without drawing attention to the quality of her attention. "Your Grace," she said, when he handed it back to her, "I know how this appears." "Do you?" His voice was not unkind. It was precise. "It appears that I am a woman of no means, no standing, and no evidence beyond a page I may have written myself, making a claim against a man who has served your household for 12 years and has your complete confidence." Edmund was quiet for a moment. "That is how it appears," he said. "Yes, then I would ask that you consider why a woman in my position would attempt this, if the story were not true." He looked at her. "Because there is nothing to gain," she said. "If I am wrong, I am a liar and a trespasser, and I have confirmed every verdict the county has already made about me. If I am right, I am still a beggar woman and a trespasser, and the gain accrues to you, not to me. My father's reputation cannot be restored by your ledgers. His leases cannot be renewed. He is dead." She said this last word flatly, without inflection, because she had said it many times, and the only way through it was through. "I am here because the truth is here. That is the only reason I am ever anywhere." The silence after this was long enough to feel intentional. "Come to the house," Edmund said, "not as a prisoner, as a person I wish to hear." He took her through the servants' entrance, which she thought was, perhaps, the first evidence of a practical mind, and seated her in a small anteroom off the main corridor, while he sent for tea and for his steward. It was not Finch who appeared first. It was a small, stout woman in a gray gown with white hair pinned under a linen cap. who stopped in the doorway and looked at Cecily with the particular attention of someone who has spent 60 years reading faces. "Well," said Mrs. Splack. Pruett, who was the Duke's housekeeper and had been at Ashcroft since before Edmund was born. "You are not what they said." "I rarely am," Cecily said. "Mrs. said." Pruett brought the tea herself and poured it, and set a plate of bread and butter beside it without commentary, and sat down across the room with her chatelaine of keys in her lap and her eyes on the door. Finch appeared 20 minutes later. He was a broad, ruddy-faced man of 48, with graying sandy hair and the practiced ease of someone who had been trusted so long he had forgotten what scrutiny felt like. He wore a dark brown wool coat and a plain cravat, and at his belt hung a ring of estate keys that rattled slightly as he walked. He had a wide, affable face with watchful, pale eyes, and the eyes went to Cecily immediately, and something moved behind them that was not surprise. "I see she has managed to gain entry to the house," he said to the Duke, rather than to her. "Your Grace, I would caution against giving this woman any further audience. She has been spreading slanders against the estate's management for some months. The beggar woman at the gate who claims to have proof of wrongdoing is a familiar kind of nuisance." Edmund, who was standing by the window, turned. "What does she claim, specifically?" Finch paused. "Tenant fraud," he said. "Specifically, that tenants were overcharged and their complaints suppressed." "And what is your answer to that claim?" "That it is fabricated, Your Grace, and that her father was himself cited for non-payment 3 years before his death, which provides a motive for slander." Edmund looked at Cecily. "Miss Vane, do you have anything to say to that?" "Yes," she said. "I can name 4 tenants, living, who paid twice and were told they had paid nothing. I can give you their names, their farms, the dates, and the amounts. I can tell you exactly where the second record of those payments is kept and why it has not been destroyed." She paused. "And I would ask Your Grace whether anyone has ever independently verified the citation against my father, or whether that account exists only in your steward's records." The room was very still. Finch's expression did not change, but the affability in it shifted, the way water shifts over a stone, and what lay beneath was not warmth. "Your Grace," he said, "this is precisely the kind of performance I expected. She is clever. They often are. Give me the names," Edmund said. He was looking at Cecily. "The 4 tenants." She gave them 4 names, 4 farms, 4 sets of dates. She gave them the same way she had kept the ledger page, precisely, without inflection, because precision was the only offering she had. Edmund wrote them down. He had produced a small notebook from his coat pocket, and he wrote each name with the concentration of a man who does not permit himself to write incorrectly. And Cecily watched the pen move and felt something in her chest that she was not accustomed to feeling. Someone was taking her account. She had spent 2 years presenting facts to people who decided, before the first word was out, what she was: a woman in poor clothing at a clerk's window, a woman without a reference at a solicitor's office, a woman who smelled of the road and spoke of ledger pages as though they were scripture, which to her they were. Every one of those encounters had been the same at the end. The figures did not matter. What mattered was the verdict that had been decided beforehand. Edmund Haverford was still writing. He asked for the dates next. She gave those too. He asked her without looking up how she had come to know the granary specifically, and she explained about the second note, the one she had left in the delivery basket, and what she had observed on her second visit about the route the steward took on Thursday afternoons and the particular weight of the sack he carried over the north wall of the granary. When he believed no one was watching, Edmund wrote this down. His face was entirely still. Mrs. Pruett across the room had not moved. She had the quality of a woman who has been patient a very long time and has learned that patience kept long enough eventually becomes something else. Her eyes moved between Edmund and Cecily with an expression that was not neutral. When Edmund finally looked up, he held her gaze for a moment without speaking. "Miss Vane," he said, "I do not know yet what is true. I intend to find out." She had not expected that, either. She was finding In this cold anteroom with its tallow smell and its tea going lukewarm and the sound of Mrs. Pruitt's keys faint at her waist, that she had been so long without anyone intending anything on her behalf that the plain statement of it felt strange in the air, like a window opened into a room that had been shut a very long time. She did not say anything. There was nothing adequate. That evening, after she had been shown to a room above the kitchen and given a meal that she ate in its entirety, and a dress belonging to one of the kitchen maids that fit her only approximately, Edmund sat in his study and was honest with himself for the first time in several weeks. He had not liked the feeling that had come over him when he heard her speak. He had not liked it because it was familiar. It was the feeling of a man recognizing something he had been looking at. Wrong. She had named the granary. He had not yet gone to look, because looking would mean deciding, and he was not yet ready to decide. Instead, he went back through the last 2 years of his own life, and applied to them quietly and without mercy, the same standard he had seen her apply to the accounts. Not what he wished were true, but what the evidence actually showed. Garrett Finch had served the Ashcroft estate for 12 years. Edmund had trusted him with the accounts, the management of the tenants, the correspondence with the solicitors, the household records. He had trusted him in particular during the 3 months in the autumn of 1812, when Edmund had been away on what Finch had told him was an urgent matter of the northern drainage leases, and during which time his wife Catherine had fallen ill, declined, and died before he reached her bedside. He had blamed himself. He had been very thorough about it. He had not once asked whether the urgent business had been urgent, in fact. He stood at the window of his study and looked at the portrait that hung above the mantel, which was Catherine's, painted the year they married. She had been 23. She had had dark eyes and a precise, patient face, the face of someone who said exactly what she meant and expected the same in return. He had not been equal to that in the early years. He thought he might have been getting there. He had not seen the note until the next morning. But that is where the accounting truly turned. The note was in the delivery basket, 3 days old, written on cheap paper in a hand he recognized from the ledger page, deliberate and clear and without embellishment. There was a second ledger. The granary, the north wall, behind the feed bins. Edmund went to the granary at dawn, before anyone was properly awake, in his coat over his nightclothes with a lantern in one hand. The north wall of the granary smelled of feed grain and old wood, and the particular cold of unheated stone in November. Behind the feed bins, stacked in a cloth sack and weighted with a piece of brick, were 14 months of a second set of estate accounts. He sat down on the granary floor and read them in the lantern light, and what they showed him was precise and quiet and devastating. Every tenant complaint that had reached him in the last 5 years had been rerouted through Finch before it arrived. The rerouting was systematic. The complaints themselves had been recorded in Finch's private copy as satisfied and resolved, while the tenants' payments had been logged in 2 separate columns. The official column showed a single payment correctly rendered. The second column showed an additional payment collected privately, which appeared in no record the tenants had ever been shown. The amounts were not enormous. They were large enough, across 5 years and 30 tenants, to make a significant fortune for a man already drawing a steward's salary. Among the papers, folded into the back cover of the account book, was a letter. The letter was dated the 16th of September, 1812. It concerned a matter of the northern drainage leases. It was written in a hand he did not recognize until he compared it carefully to Finch's normal correspondence, and then he recognized it completely. The matter, the letter described, was urgent. The Duke's presence was required immediately. It was not urgent. He understood this as clearly as he had ever understood anything in his life. The drainage lease in question had been renewed, without incident, the following spring, entirely without Edmund's intervention. There had been no crisis. There had only been a letter, and a man who had needed the Duke absent while he attended to accounts he did not wish the Duke to see, and a woman who had died with her husband not yet home. Edmund sat on the granary floor for some time. When he rose and went back to the house, he did not go to see Finch. He went to find Mrs. Pruitt. She was already awake. She was always already awake. She was in the kitchen with a cup of tea and what appeared to be a list of provisions for the week. And she looked up when he came in and set down her pen with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a particular conversation and is relieved. "It has arrived." "How long have you known?" he said. "Known what?" "Specifically, Your Grace, that there was something wrong in the accounts." She folded her hands over her list. 5 years, she said. "I knew the Vane family. I knew Charles Vane. He was not a man who failed to pay what he owed." Edmund sat down across from her at the kitchen table. "You should have told me. I had no proof," she said. "And you had no reason to question a man you trusted." The young woman had the proof. I recognized that when she first came to the gate. She paused. "I also recognized what Finch was doing to her. He told you she was spreading slanders. He has been telling that to everyone." It was here in the corridor outside the kitchen that Edmund overheard the footman. He had not been intending to listen. He had stood and was stepping toward the door when the voice reached him through the gap, a young man's voice, apologetic, giving a report to someone he believed was alone. "I was told to pass it along, Mrs. Pruitt. Mr. Blum." Finch's instructions were that the beggar woman says the steward has the second ledger hid in the granary, and we were to say nothing about it to anyone, and that she's to be removed from the estate grounds before she says anything further. Edmund stopped. He stood in the corridor and was very still. Then he went to find Finch. He did not find him in time. Finch, who had the quickness of a man with 12 years of practice in reading the estate's weather, had already sent a rider to town. By noon, a magistrate's constable arrived with a warrant. The charge was theft. Specifically, the theft of 2 pages of accounting documents from the offices of the late Charles Vane, said documents being the property of an estate under administration, and their removal constituting an offense against the lawful administration thereof. It was, Edmund thought, as he stood in the main hall and heard this read aloud, a very competent piece of legal architecture. It turned the only evidence against Finch into an offense committed by the person who had found it. It made the witness the criminal. It required him to do nothing except let the law proceed, and if the law proceeded, she would be taken before the magistrate. The ledger page would be removed as evidence of her offense rather than Finch's, and the granary accounts would remain exactly where Finch would retrieve them before anyone else returned. Edmund looked at Cecily, who was standing very straight beside the constable. She had put on the borrowed dress that morning and done her hair in a loose updo that had the appearance of composure without the ease of it. Her hands were at her sides, slightly ink-stained at the fingers, entirely. Still, she met his eyes and held them, and her face said nothing he could read, but her hands said what her face would not. She had known it might come to this. She had come anyway. She had told him, in the gatehouse, that there was nothing to gain. If she was right, she was still a beggar woman and a trespasser. And the gain accrued to him, not to her. And he looked at Finch, who stood slightly behind the constable, with the key ring at his belt, and the wide, affable face arranged into an expression of regretful necessity. "Your Grace," Finch said, "I am sorry it has come to this. The documents were taken without authorization, and the law requires." Edmund said nothing. Lady Harwick, who had been invited to a dinner that evening, and had arrived early, and was now standing at the edge of the hall with her pearl earrings and her ice-blue gown, leaned slightly toward the woman beside her, and said in a voice that carried, "I understand the beggar woman has been taken up from the grounds again. One hopes the Duke will now have done with it." Edmund heard this. He let it land. He let the whole room land. Then he spoke. "Constable," he said, "you will take Miss Vane to your custody. I will accompany her to the magistrate. I have evidence to present." The magistrate's anteroom was a cold, low room in the town of Harrow that smelled of old wood and official paper, and Cecily sat in it for the better part of 2 hours with a constable at the door and the folded ledger page in her hand and no particular expectation of what would happen next. She had not expected the Duke to come to the granary. She had not expected to be heard at all. She had not been in the habit of expecting things to go in her favor, because the machinery of the world was not built to favor women who smelled of the road and carried their evidence in their boots, and had no name left worth the using. She had come because she could not stop. She had kept going because stopping felt like agreeing, and she could not agree. Thomas found her before the Duke arrived. He had followed the party from the estate without anyone noticing because 9-year-old boys are small and serious and can move through a crowd without interrupting it, and he slipped into the anteroom and stood in front of Cecily with his dark eyes very serious and his hands in his coat pockets. "Are you frightened?" he said. She looked at him. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "I heard what the steward said," Thomas told her. "About you. He said it before, to Mrs. Pruitt. He said it when you first came to the gate." He paused. She did not believe him. "I know," Cecily said. "I did not believe him either." He reached into his coat pocket and produced with some ceremony a piece of shortbread wrapped in a handkerchief. "I thought you might want this." She took it. She ate it. She thanked him. He sat down beside her on the bench and did not speak again, but his presence was steady, and she was grateful for it. Edmund arrived with a leather satchel and the granary accounts, and the letter dated the 16th of September, 1812. What followed was not quick. It was deliberate and procedural and thorough, in the way that justice sometimes is when it has been a long time coming, and someone is finally willing to set it in motion. Edmund presented the second accounts to the magistrate, Mr. Alderton, who was a careful man in his 60s with a great deal of experience and a very low tolerance for being made a fool of. He examined the dates. He examined the columns. He compared the double entries to the estate's official records, which Edmund had brought as well. Then he read the letter of the 16th of September, 1812. The room was silent while he read it. When he looked up, he looked at Finch, who had accompanied them with his usual air of regretful necessity, and who was now standing near the wall, with his arms folded and his watchful, pale eyes moving between the magistrate and the Duke and the accounts. "Mr. Finch," Alderton said, "this letter, did you write it?" "It is not my hand," Finch said. "I have here 3 other letters in your hand," Edmund said. "I collected them this morning." He laid them on the table. "You will observe the particular formation of the capital F, and the habit of crossing the T with a slight left-hand angle. They are the same in each." Finch looked at the letters. Something shifted in his face, the affability finally receding completely. And what was underneath it was not warm. Edmund looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned to where Cecily was standing just inside the door with Thomas still beside her, and the folded ledger page in her hand, and he crossed the room, not quickly. Deliberately, the way a man moves when he has made a decision and is not uncertain of it. He turned to face Finch, and the magistrate, and the constable, and the whole assembled weight of the official afternoon. "Miss Vane is under my protection," he said. "Take your keys, Finch." The sentence was short. It was 12 words. It contained no poetry, and no performance, and no excess. It landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water, and the silence after it spread outward to every wall. Finch stared at him. "Your Grace," he began. "The keys," Edmund said. Alderton had already reached for his pen. The constable had already shifted his weight. Finch reached for the key-ring at his belt, with the slow, particular movement of a man whose certainty has failed him all at once, and the keys rang against the table when he set them down. A bright and final sound in the cold official room. Mrs. Pruitt appeared in the doorway. She had followed them too, apparently. In the second carriage, with the original lease documents for Charles Vane's last 3 years of tenancy, which she had been keeping in the bottom of her linen press for 4 years, having retrieved them from the estate's correspondence before they could be misfiled. She set them on the table beside the accounts without comment, gave Finch one long look, and went to stand beside Cecily. Alderton was thorough. It took another hour. At the end of it, the charge against Cecily had been dismissed, the warrant withdrawn, and Finch had been remanded to the custody of the constable to await a full accounting of the estate's books, which would be conducted by an independent auditor, and which would take several months. Lady Harwick, who had followed in her own carriage, and was now in the corridor outside the magistrate's room, received the news of this through the closed door, via the expression on the face of her companion who had been listening at the gap. She smoothed her gloves, adjusted the drape of her ice-blue skirt, and left without speaking to anyone. The 4 named tenants came forward within the fortnight. One of them, a farmer named Heathcott, brought his own second set of receipts, which he had kept, he said, because his wife had told him never to trust a man who smiled like that. Between his records and Cecily's ledger page and Mrs. Bling, Pruett's retained leases, and the granary accounts. The picture was very complete. Charles Vane's name was cleared in the county record before December. The announcement was brief and official, and printed without ceremony. But Cecily read it 3 times in the morning room at Ashcroft and felt something in her chest release that she had not entirely known was clenched. Edmund had asked her the evening after the magistrate's hearing to stay at the estate while the audit was conducted. He had phrased this as a practical arrangement. The auditor would need a guide to the accounts, and she knew the material better than anyone. And her situation was not presently such that she had an address to which she might return. She had agreed. Because it was practical. And because Mrs. Pruett had pressed her hand at the doorway with the firmness of a woman who has decided something and is not interested in argument, and because Thomas had shown her the morning room and pointed out that it had the best light in the house and a writing desk that no one was using. She had told herself it was temporary. 3 weeks later she was still in the morning room. The light came in at an angle in the mornings that was exactly right for fine work, and she had been doing fine work since the 2nd day. The Ashcroft accounts, the legitimate ones, had been kept in a state of polished but deliberate obscurity by Finch for long enough that untangling them required patience and time and the ability to hold many simultaneous figures in one's head without losing the thread. Cecily had all of these things in good supply. She ruled her columns with the care her father had taught her. She noted discrepancies in a separate hand. She cross-referenced dates. She was doing this on a Tuesday morning in December, when the door opened. She did not look up, because she was in the middle of a column and losing the sum now would cost her 10 minutes. "Miss Vane," said Edmund's voice. "A moment," she said. He waited. She finished the column, checked the total, set down her pen, and looked up. He was in the doorway, his navy coat and his white cravat and his gray eyes and the scar across his left brow. And he was holding a small wrapped parcel. He looked for the first time since she had known him, slightly at a loss. "Thomas asked me to bring this," he said, which was plainly not the sentence he had come to say. "Thomas is 7 feet away in the kitchen," Cecily said. "He could have brought it himself." He said, Edmund said with the gravity of a man reporting very precisely, "that he thought you might be less likely to send it back if I brought it." Thomas appeared around Edmund's elbow with a plate of shortbread, and a satisfaction on his face that was, for a 9-year-old, impressively controlled. Cecily took the shortbread. She looked at Edmund. He was looking at her hands, at the ink stain on her right forefinger that she could not seem to wash out completely, the same one her father had always had. His expression was the particular composure of a man who is not going to say the thing he means to say yet, but who has decided to stop pretending he does not mean it. "Mrs. Stapey, Pruett has said," he began, "that the audit will require a good deal more time than initially estimated. Several months, at minimum." "That is accurate," Cecily said. "The secondary ledger introduces a complication in the quarterly rent calculations that has to be unwound, year by year. It would be impractical," he said, "for the person conducting the audit to be in town. Quite impractical. There is also," he said, "the matter of the position." She waited. "A state secretary," he said, "a formal appointment with a proper salary and a proper set of rooms, which are not above the kitchen." He paused. "Mrs. Pruett insisted on the last part." "Did she?" Cecily said. She was quite firm about it. He did not move from the doorway. Thomas had retreated with the shortbread plate and was now, with commendable tact, entirely absent. The morning room was very quiet, and the December light came through the window at the angle that was exactly right, and the Duke of Ashcroft was looking at her the way he had looked at the ledger page in the gatehouse, as if he were reading something he had not had a category for until now, and was revising his categories entirely. "Cecily," he said. It was the first time. She knew it was the first time because nothing in her body was unprepared for it, and nothing in her body was ready for it, both things at once, and she felt the warmth of it arrive before she could compose herself against it. "Your Grace," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the gesture of a man who has spent 3 years not permitting himself anything that resembled ease and has now encountered something that makes ease feel like a reasonable thing. He crossed the room. He stopped at the corner of the writing desk, close enough that she could see the silver in his hair and the scar across his brow, and the particular gray of his eyes that was not cold, had perhaps never been cold, had been this, careful and watching and waiting for something he could be certain of. He reached out very slowly and covered her ink-stained hand with his own. She turned her hand under his and held it. Outside the morning room window, the first snow of December was beginning to fall on the Ashcroft grounds, soft and without urgency, the way proper things arrive when they have waited long enough. Inside, the fire in the grate had been laid by Mrs. Pruitt an hour ago, because Mrs. Pruitt laid fires with the understanding that they would be needed before the person who needed them knew it. On the writing desk, in a small frame that had belonged to Cecily's father, and that Mrs. E. Burra Pruitt had found in a box of recovered effects from the house on Church Street, and set there without comment on the morning of the second week, was the folded ledger page. The numbers were still legible. Her father's hand was still precise across the columns. She did not need to carry it in her boot anymore. Thomas reappeared in the doorway at tea time with a tray and a composure that was entirely spoiled by the expression on his face, which was the expression of a 9-year-old who has done something good and cannot quite contain his knowledge of it. Mrs. Pruitt appeared behind him with the teapot. She looked at the two of them, at the writing desk, at their joined hands, at the fire and the snow and the settled quality of the room, and she set the teapot down with the manner of a woman who has been patient for a very long time and is not sorry. Edmund said her name once more, quietly, in the way that a man says a name when the saying of it is a kind of answer. And the snow kept falling on Ashcroft, soft and steady, and it did not stop.